The more Washington rests its foreign policy on Beijing and Moscow's present actions, the more it sees strategic initiative to them. This is one of the central arguments of the new book, America's Great Power Opportunity, written by Wyne, senior analyst at the Eurasia Group. Joining me today is the author, Wyne. Thank you so much for being here with me, Ali.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on.
So, Ali, before we get started, can you first help us understand the concept of great power competition and sort of the history behind how great power competition became the pillar of U.S. foreign policy discussions?
So here's one of the paradoxes of the term, and I promise I'll get to your question. I'm not stalling or trying to evade the question, but
Sure.
I think it's important for the conversation. So one of the central paradoxes of the term or the construct great power competition is that on the one hand, it's ubiquitous. It's also underspecified. And something that I discovered in the course of researching the book, interviewing dozens of individuals for the book, is that I encounter the term a lot. And yet when I would put the same question to them that you just put to me, namely, how do you define great power competition? I found some level of agreement at a bird's eye view. So at a bird's eye view, at a 30,000 foot view, there's a general sense that great power competition means America's two principal nation state competitors, namely China and Russia, they're increasingly able and willing to push back against U.S. influence, to undercut U.S. influence. So at a bird's eye view, there's some general sense of what great power competition entails. But when you get down to brass tacks, when you get down to the details and ask, what exactly is the United States competing over? What is it competing for? What are the objectives of great power competition? There's a lot of disagreement. So I think that the first point I would make is that there is this discrepancy between invocation of the term on the one hand and interpretation on the other, despite, as I said earlier, a general sense that it means greater contestation with China and Russia. So how did this term become such a central pillar of foreign policy discourse? I think that there are two reasons. One, as we were just discussing, it's undeniably the case that the United States is relatively today, it's no longer as influential as it was at the end of the Cold War, 2 decades ago, a decade ago. It's undeniably the case that China and Russia are increasingly able and willing to push back against U.S. influence. So I think great power competition, it distills an important aspect of contemporary geopolitics, these increasing strategic frictions between the United States on the one hand, China and Russia on the other. So there's that element at play. I think that there's another element at play, and I try to explain a little bit of this chronology, albeit in a very abbreviated form, in the introductory chapter of the book. So we have to rewind the clock to the end of the Cold War. When the Cold War ends, there is a lot of triumphalism in the American body politique among mainstream commentators, and for good reason. The United States had been preoccupied with an existential challenger for the better part of half a century, and now this titanic struggle was over. So one of the articles that I came across that really helps explain, and it was very, very forward-thinking in terms of why great power competition has assumed its present centrality, I came across a speech which was later rendered as a New York Times op-ed by George Kennan, no less than George Kennan, who was arguably the foremost avatar of containment. So George Kennan, he gives a speech to the Council on Foreign Relations in February 1994 to mark the occasion of his 90th birthday. And Kennan is asked to reflect on containment, the doctrine with which he was prominently associated. He was asked to reflect on the state of geopolitics in the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse. And Kennan gives a very sober address, a very kind of measured address. And he says, the good news is the Soviet Union is gone. So the prospect of a great power nuclear war has substantially receded. He said, the bad news is that the United States has won something of a Pyrrhic victory. Well, what did he mean by that statement? He said that for the better part of the past 60 years, so keep in mind, this speech is in 1994, so now he's taking us back to the 1930s. He said that for the better part of the past 60 years, U.S. foreign policy has been so preoccupied with dealing with overarching external challengers, so Japan, Germany, and then, of course, the Soviet Union, that he said that basically with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we also lost the ballast for U.S. foreign policy. And so Kennan said U.S. foreign policymakers are going to struggle to adapt to a world in which there isn't some overarching challenger. And so in the 1990s, the United States, I think, arguably was strategically adrift, in part because it was a victim of its own success. It had so much power relative to any other potential competitors that there was a vigorous debate in the 1990s, just what should the United States do with this tremendous inheritance of power? So we were strategically adrift. In the 2000s, for the better part of the 2000s, counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, they provided something of a ballast for U.S. foreign policy, but it was a partial one, and it never really galvanized the American politic. It never really galvanized policymakers to the same extent that our confrontation with the Soviet Union did. And then in the early years of the 2010s, I think the United States kind of experimented with one of the first real incarnations of what was known as the pivot or the rebalance. But as it tried to pivot or rebalance to the Asia Pacific, we had the Russian incursion into Ukraine and annexation of Crimea. We had upheaval in the Middle East, which kind of derailed that initiative. All of which is sort of a long-winded preamble to say, with that incursion, so in 2014, with Russia's incursion into Crimea, and then slowly, I think particularly starting around maybe 2014, 2015, this slow drip Chinese reclamation of territory in the South China Sea, to the Russian incursion into Ukraine, China's slow drip reclamation of territory in the South China Sea begin to focus the minds of policymakers more and more on strategic frictions with China and Russia. And then, of course, the key inflection point comes in 2017. So the Trump administration publishes, at the end of 2017, publishes its national security strategy and really elevates great power competition to be the central organizing principle of U.S. foreign policy. A month later, the Department of Defense under the Trump administration releases its national defense strategy, corroborating that judgment. And so I think, and I'll just make one last point and I'll stop. So I think that great power competition has assumed its present centrality in part because it distills a very, as I said, an important aspect of contemporary geopolitics. The United States is engaged in increasing strategic competition with China and Russia on the one hand, but there's also a sense that with that strategic anxiety, there's a sense of, you could say, almost bureaucratic comfort or a sense of bureaucratic relief in a strange way, because there's a feeling that perhaps the United States can resume a familiar playbook. The United States has dealt with overarching challenges before. U.S. foreign policy has been substantially predicated upon competitions with external challengers. And so I think that there's a sense that with a resurgent China, with an irredentist Russia, perhaps the United States has it has a familiar script. It has external challengers. It can galvanize the body politique. It can lubricate the foreign policy apparatus. And so I think that there's a sense that finally, perhaps the United States has restored the strategic clarity for which it's been questing for the better part of 30 years.
Right. So in the framework you just laid out, the U.S. policy seems defensive and reactive. What are the concrete risks associated with that policy framework? Can you sort of elaborate on the risks a little bit more?
Sure. So I think there are a number of risks, and I would identify three of them. So the first risk is the great power competition. Again, distinguishing between great power competition descriptively and prescriptively. So my critiques are more with great power competition as a prescription as opposed to a description. I think the first risk is that there's a risk that it generates a reactive foreign policy, a defensive U.S. foreign policy. So if your foreign policy is largely tethered to the actions and decisions of your external competitors, and if absent those competitors, you struggle to articulate an affirmative direction of your own, then necessarily you're going to cede a lot of strategic initiative to your competitors. So there's a risk that you allow your principal competitors to dictate the terms of competition, and that you basically are awaiting their next initiative, their next decision, their next provocation, and you're waiting to respond in kind. So I think the first risk is that of a reactive defensive foreign policy. The second risk, and actually this risk is, I think in a way should be a source of comfort for the United States. I think that great power competition as a policy framework, it risks actually, I would say needlessly, aggrandizing the strategic acumen of China and Russia. Now, I hasten to note, China and Russia, these are serious competitors. They are multidimensional competitors. I suspect that they're likely to be enduring competitors. I think it's very unlikely that either of them is going to suffer a Soviet-style dramatic disintegration. So I want to be very clear that strategic competition, it is an enduring aspect of interstate relations, and I think that the management of those strategic frictions is going to continue to be an essential element of U.S. foreign policy. So we shouldn't be sanguine, but I think that there's a risk that we swing too far, that we allow the pendulum to overcorrect. So in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, I think it's fair to say that the United States succumbed to complacency in thinking about potential challengers, but we want to ensure that we don't go from complacency to consternation. And I think that there's a risk in making great power competition our central organizing policy framework that we aggrandize China and Russia. So to take China first, and then I'll turn to Russia. China, obviously, it possesses the world's second largest economy. That economic heft is allowing it to make inroads, military inroads, economic inroads, technological inroads, and so forth across the world. But I think that there is a critical gap between, on the one hand, China's growing economic heft, and it's on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's growing diplomatic estrangement, particularly from advanced industrial democracies. Now, keep in mind, advanced industrial democracies, again, they're not as preponderant as they were at the turn of the century, but between them, they do still wield the balance of aggregated military and economic power. It's difficult for me to see how China sustains its present trajectory if it continues to estrange itself from that very powerful set of advanced industrial democracies. And I think that the diplomacy that China has conducted in recent years, particularly since the onset of the coronavirus pandemic, it's been very counterproductive. So let's rewind the clock to about 2 years ago, or maybe a little over 2 years ago. So think about what the international narratives were like in, say, March 2020, April 2020. At the time, the global narratives were that China had successfully contained the coronavirus pandemic at home. It had contained the economic fallout of the pandemic at home. And having demonstrated its administrative competence at home, it was now training its sights outward, and it was going to help the rest of the world recover. So it was shipping equipment of personal protective equipment abroad. It was sending teams of doctors abroad to countries in distress. That was the depiction of China. The United States, on the other hand, it was seen as it was flailing. It was incompetent. There was a raging pandemic that was inflicting tremendous damage across the United States. There was a fast-moving recession. There were protests against racial injustice. And so there was this juxtaposition of a China that seemed to be firmly in control and a United States that seemed to be firmly not in control. Imagine if, given that juxtaposition of narratives, imagine if China had seized that window of opportunity to say, we've got the United States where we want it. We're going to press pause on intimidating Taiwan. We're going to press pause on cracking down on Hong Kong. We're going to stabilize our relationships with our powerful democratic neighbors, Australia, India, Japan, and South Korea. We're going to try to get this comprehensive agreement on investment across the finish line with the European Union. And we're going to try to take some steps to stabilize our relationship with the United States. As a result of the diplomacy that China has pursued in recent years, basically the exact opposite has happened. So with the exception of Russia, and I imagine that we'll talk about the Sino-Russian relationship in due course, but with the exception of China's relationship with Russia, China's relationships with virtually every single major power are either stagnant or deteriorating. So that's China. Russia, of course. Russia, with its invasion of Ukraine, has committed one of the foremost acts of strategic self-sabotage in the post-war era. Russia is now, it has reinvigorated NATO, and it's very likely that at the end of the month, we'll see that Finland and Sweden are granted, they're granted admission to NATO. So Russia has given NATO a new lease on life. Russia has given the transatlantic project a new lease on life. Russia has rendered itself yet further beholden to China. Russia has hemorrhaged critical military assets. It's hemorrhaged a lot of economic influence. So again, a really, really catastrophic act of self-sabotage. So the second risk of great power competition, just to summarize, is we don't want to understate our competitors. We also don't want to aggrandize them. Understating our competitors breeds complacency, which is not good for long-term competitiveness. Overstating their competitiveness breeds fatalism or alarmism, which is also not good for our competitiveness. The third and final risk I'll discuss with great power competition as a policy framework is it risks casting really any kind of, I shouldn't say diplomatic engagement, but it risks casting any kind of cooperative pursuits as fool's errands at best, and more likely at worst as exhibitions of strategic weakness. And the reality is that even as strategic frictions with China and Russia intensify, I can't conceive of a scenario in which the United States can advance its vital national interests on the full panoply of transnational challenges, macroeconomic, sort of fighting macroeconomic instability, fighting climate change, fighting nuclear proliferation, on and on. I can't identify or sketch the contours of a plausible scenario in which the United States can advance its vital national interests on those issues that I just enumerated solely in conjunction with its allies and partners, essentially to say, we're going to take China and Russia, attempt to lock them away in a strategic lockbox, take away the key. China and Russia are they're too large. They're too consequential. And so the United States is going to have to find some way, selectively. Obviously, the United States is not going to be able to cooperate with China and Russia on every issue. And there are going to be, I suspect that there will be many issues where cooperative space will be limited at best. But there has to be some modicum, some baseline of cooperative space on those transnational challenges. And I fear that if we make great power competition too central an organizing framework, we risk missing out even on those minimal cooperative opportunities.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that insight. So I have a follow-up question on China. Do you agree with the notion that we hear sometimes that China's ambition is to achieve global preeminence, overtaking the United States? Or do you think that's sort of a misreading of China's actual goal?
So one scholar whose work I really respect on this point is Joel Wuthnow. He teaches at National Defense University, and he makes the argument that esteemed scholars of China's domestic politics, esteemed scholars and observers of China's foreign policy, they can survey the same evidence and they can render different judgments. So there are very distinguished observers who do believe that China, in due course, it seeks to replace the United States as the preeminent power in the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, and then in time it seeks to overtake the United States for global preeminence. There's some observers who say that China doesn't seek to overtake the United States for global preeminence, but it wants to establish a firmer sphere of influence in its neighborhood. It seeks to replace the United States as the preeminent regional power. So, and I think that the point that I would make is that, again, this is again Dr. Wuthnow's point, is that it's very difficult it's very difficult to find or to sort of assess which documents, which kinds of evidence dispositively establish China's strategic intentions. And he makes the point that unless we are sitting with President Xi and his top advisors, and unless we're privy to their innermost deliberations, we're going to be somewhat aiming in the dark in trying to discern China's long-term strategic intentions. One other point that I would make is that we shouldn't necessarily presume the immutability of intentions. Intentions can evolve for a number of reasons. Intentions can evolve depending on a country's position in the international system. Intentions can evolve depending on the configuration of domestic challenges, the configuration of external challenges. And so you may have certain intentions, but depending on how your domestic political environment evolves, how your external strategic environment evolves, you may modify your intentions. But I think that there's an important point, and I try to present this thought exercise in the chapter in the book devoted to China's resurgence. I think it's illuminating in thinking about what U.S. foreign policy should be. Let's leave aside for a moment the question of China's intentions. Let's say that China's intentions are fixed and that they're maximalist. So let's assume, kind of going to the first part of your question, let's assume that China wants to replace the United States in its region. It wants to replace the United States globally as the world's preeminent power, and that it not only wants to do that, but it wants to go a step further. It wants to dissolve the current U.S.-led post-war order, and it wants to establish a post-war order that is more grounded in China's preferred norms, laws, arrangements, and so forth. So let's assume that to be the case. Let's hold those intentions to be constant. And I think that thought experiment, it allows us to focus more on what material capabilities China would be able to bring to bear in service of those objectives, but also importantly, what limitations, what challenges China might encounter along the way. And I do think that there are formidable challenges that China faces both at home and abroad. And it's a familiar panoply of challenges, but I think it's still worth enumerating. So at home, China's demographic outlook is increasingly grim. China's growth model is coming under increasing strain. It'll be interesting to see how this dual circulation model, how much traction it will gain over the medium to long term. So a number of, and also just political unrest. One of the concerns I think a number of observers have is that, President Xi, he has really pushed back on a lot of the norms of kind of personnel succession, institutional succession that Deng Xiaoping attempted to entrench. And so there are concerns about whether he could be setting China up for some kind of leadership crisis in years or decades to come. So we have a range of domestic challenges. And then, of course, turning to China's periphery and looking further afield, China faces a much more contested external environment. So I think that China had some hope that perhaps it could de facto absorb Taiwan without having to resort to force. Essentially, it could de facto achieve the reunification of Taiwan with mainland China via growing economic integration. That gambit hasn't worked out, as we've seen. I think that Hong Kong is becoming more of a thorn in China's side as well. I think that China had, again, similarly hoped that it could gradually snuff out freedoms in Hong Kong without eliciting much international attention, but Hong Kong is generating more and more international attention. Further afield, the Quad. The Quad, prior to the onset of the coronavirus pandemic, I think that a number of observers, myself included, so I don't want to pretend that I wasn't one of them, I thought prior to the onset of the coronavirus pandemic that the Quad, it would limp along, it would generate some halting momentum, but that it really wouldn't achieve escape velocity. What we've seen now is that the Quad has a new lease on life. Just under the Biden administration, we've already had 4 leader-level meetings of the Quad. It has a significant lease on life. AUKUS, an agreement that would have been inconceivable as recently as a few years ago, it now has moved across the finish line. Take the European Union. The European Union has pressed pause on ratifying the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment with China. It brought a trade case against China to the World Trade Organization this January, so the EU is starting to take a sterner disposition towards China. And then, of course, the United States, on a bipartisan basis, is looking at China in a much dimmer way. And so when you look at China's internal challenges, you look at this increasingly contested external environment, it's difficult for me to see how China achieves regional hegemony, let alone global hegemony. A few other points that I would make. China doesn't have a reserve currency. I think it's a very far ways away from having a reserve currency. China, it doesn't have liquid capital markets that would facilitate the achievement of that reserve currency. It also doesn't have a network of alliances and partnerships comparable to that which the United States possesses. And One of the scholars to whom I often turn in reflecting on this point is Professor Yang Shui-Tong from Tsinghua University. He wrote an op-ed a little over a decade ago in the New York Times entitled "How China Can Defeat America." And in this op-ed, he enumerates a number of what he believes to be China's unique competitive advantages and America's competitive liabilities. But he says that the crux of competition, I'm roughly paraphrasing Professor Yang, but he says that the crux of competition is going to come down to which country, namely the United States or China, which country has more, I believe the phrase he uses is high-quality friends, essentially allies and partners. And Professor Yan has been exhorting China that it needs to invest more in cultivating a network of alliances and partnerships comparable to that which the United States possesses. And his proposition is that until and unless China is able to achieve that type of network, it's going to find it very difficult to compete with the United States over the long haul. So there are a range of internal challenges, there are a range of external challenges. And so whatever your assessment is of China's intentions, whether you believe that China's intentions are more modest or whether you believe that China's intentions are maximally vaulting, you have to look at the discrepancy between intentions, whatever you believe they may be, and the reality of China's power and trajectory on the other. And I think that if we probe and we scrutinize some of China's challenges at home, its challenges abroad, I think that we would be more inclined to reach a conclusion that whatever its ambitions might be, that it's going to face a number of hurdles in achieving them.
Right. And speaking of the other authoritarian power in the world, Russia, your book has a very helpful chapter providing a timely update on the Russo-Ukrainian war, which we recommend our audience to take a look. So we are roughly 4 months into this war now. How would you evaluate the U.S. government's response to the war so far?
So I think that the Biden administration, it deserves significant credit, not only for how it has responded thus far, but I think importantly, let's go back to, let's say, this past fall. So starting around sort of October, November, for roughly sort of 3.5 months, in the roughly 3.5 month run up to Russia's fateful decision to invade Ukraine on February 24th, there were a number of really innovative, I think, strategies that the Biden administration deployed. But I think what perhaps the most innovative was publicizing and really sharing with the rest of the world, publicizing select excerpts of intelligence assessments saying, this is what we believe, this is what the U.S. intelligence community believes that Russia intends to do. In the aftermath of America's withdrawal from Afghanistan, and then in the aftermath of pushing it for this AUKUS agreement, I think that there were a lot of sort of raw feelings, a lot of strains between the United States and core allies and partners, particularly in Europe. And so the United States, as it was growing increasingly apprehensive about what Russia intended to do, it had to do a lot of additional work, I think, beyond that which it might have had to do otherwise if relations with its allies and partners hadn't been as strained. It had to do a lot of additional work to generate credibility for its assessment. And so the United States, it really went into overdrive, consulting with European allies and partners very, very intimately, very closely, very frequently, saying, this is what our intelligence assessments are revealing, this is what we believe Russia intends to do. And of course, the intelligence community's assessments turned out to be exactly right. Russia didn't launch a special military operation, it launched a full-scale invasion, which, as you said, is now approaching the 4-month mark. So that's sort of in the run-up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then in terms of what the United States has done since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I suspect that Russia probably factored into its decision to invade Ukraine. It probably priced in some level of military response, some level of diplomatic response, some level of economic response. But I suspect that it anticipated that it would engender a response in the West akin to that which it engendered in 2014 with its incursion into Ukraine and then its subsequent annexation of Crimea. The Western response this time around, though, it was I think it vastly surpassed not only Russia's expectation, I suspect it actually surpassed the expectations of many Western leaders. If you look at particularly, I think if you look at sort of the level of, or I should say the degree of cohesion, and particularly cohesion as we've seen not only with shipping arms to Ukraine, imposing sanctions on Russia, I think that Russia was probably taken aback by the degree of unanimity, the forcefulness of the military response, the forcefulness of the economic response. Now the real question, though, comes, and there's, I think, sort of a growing sort of discussion in the United States, there's a growing discussion in Europe. There's more discussion of, okay, we've responded forcefully to Russian aggression militarily and economically, but how does the war end? What does the resolution look like? Because there's a fear, there are a number of fears. Number one, we've seen that the externalities of the war, we're not even fully 4 months in, but the externalities of this war are already becoming more and more pronounced. So whether you look at disruptions to global energy markets, disruptions to global food markets, which are driving up food insecurity very significantly, there is a concern that if those externalities are left unchecked, they could really, really wreak havoc on not only on the United States and its key European and Asian allies and partners, but there's a real concern that those externalities could wreak havoc on vast stretches of the developing world. And we're seeing this, of course, with the blockade of Ukrainian ports. Ukraine is one of the major exporters of grain, which, of course, is a crucial staple in many countries in the developing world. So I think the one concern is how do we achieve a resolution to this war? Because if this war goes on indefinitely, then the externalities of this war are going to persist indefinitely, and I think there's tremendous concern there. There's also a concern that Russia, if it feels that it has no pathway to rehabilitation, if it feels that it has no stake left in the post-war order, if it believes that it's going to be humiliated, there's a concern that post-war Russia, even though it will be militarily weaker, economically weaker, it still is going to be a major power, but it's going to be far more embittered, it's going to be far more aggrieved, and potentially then far more prone to reckless military behavior, not only in Ukraine, but perhaps beyond. And there obviously is a concern that we want to mitigate, or we want to reduce that possibility. And of course, we want to reduce the possibility of the ultimate doomsday scenario, namely an armed confrontation between NATO forces on the one hand and Russian forces on the other hand that could escalate to the nuclear level. So you're starting to see now, I think, more of a discussion in the United States, more of a discussion in Europe about how does this war end, on what terms does it end, and it's a very, very difficult balance to strike. Obviously, Ukraine is a sovereign country. It's defending itself from a really, really horrific, brutal Russian invasion. And so the United States and its core allies and partners, they have to uphold sovereignty. They have to uphold the principles of sovereignty. They have to uphold the principles of territorial integrity. And they also have to, but they have to balance those considerations with the recognition that a Russia that feels completely divorced from the international community, that feels it has no pathway to rehabilitation, it could wreak even further havoc. It could wreak even further inflict even further devastation on Ukraine, even further devastation on Europe. It could engage in even more military adventurism, and those are very concerning possibilities. So it's, again, diplomacy, really, really difficult balancing act, and I certainly don't envy policymakers in either the United States or Europe who are confronting this dilemma about how you provide for Ukraine's defense, uphold the norms of sovereignty and territorial integrity on the one hand, but also ensure that there is a pathway to de-escalation, there is an off-ramp, there is a pathway to a diplomatic resolution. You saw U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. He said just a few days ago, he says that the only way in which this war ends is through some kind of diplomatic resolution. So there's an emphasis now on what are the parameters of resolution, what role does diplomacy play, and certainly I think that the sooner this war ends on terms that are hopefully, there's some hopefully overlap, however minimal in my view, but the real key task for diplomacy is if you look at what Ukraine considers acceptable, if you look at what Russia considers acceptable, and if you look at what the United States and its core allies and partners consider to be acceptable, is there even a sliver of overlap in that Venn diagram? And the task of diplomacy is to probe, to find that small sliver, and to act upon it.
Right. And there's a follow-up question, which is potentially an aftermath of the war, which is a tightening of Russia and China's relations. We haven't seen concrete evidence of China actually backing up Putin's war, but Moscow and Beijing do seem to find themselves in increasing alignment, unified by their grievances against the United States. So how do you think Russia and China's this bilateral relationship will evolve in the aftermath of the war, and what's the implication for the United States?
Sure. So I think the Sino-Russian Entente, it's a paradox. I think it's simultaneously stronger but more strained. Well, what do I mean? How can it be both stronger and more strained? I think in some ways it's stronger by default because Russia, as I said a few minutes ago, Russia by virtue now of being of having been basically cut off, and I think it will continue to be cut off from many advanced industrial democracies so long as Vladimir Putin is at the helm of Russia. So having been basically cut off economically, diplomatically, technologically from advanced industrial democracies, it's by default now more dependent on China. So the Sino-Russian relationship, it's strengthened in part because Russia is now more beholden to China. And I think that China also recognizes that because Russia is weaker, that China can extract further concessions from Russia on shipments of, say, energy or weapons. So it's stronger for that reason. It's also stronger because I think that China and Russia, as you said, they do share a number of grievances. And I think that if you look at the statement between China and Russia on February 4th, if you look at the readout from the call between President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin that took place on June 15th, you see an enunciation of the shared grievances. You see a commitment to broaching what an alternative security order would look like. You see declarations that say that the post-war order should not be so centered on the United States. It shouldn't rely on sanctioning one's opponents. It shouldn't rely on one reserve currency, so on and so forth. So you do see a number of shared grievances, and I think that China and Russia are increasingly doubling down in articulating shared conceptions of those grievances. So stronger on the one hand, also more strained on the other hand. Why is it more strained? My sense, and again, I'm speculating, I'm hypothesizing. I obviously wasn't in the room when President Xi and President Putin had their when they've had their conversations. But my speculation is that Russia probably gave China some indication. I think President Putin probably gave President Xi some indication that Russia was going to undertake some operation in Ukraine. And my hypothesis is that China believed either that it would indeed just be a special military operation, or that if Russia did actually launch an invasion, that Ukraine would capitulate immediately. Because you remember in the run-up to the war, many observers said, if Russia invades, this war is going to be over before it starts. We were talking a matter of days or weeks. If you look at the imbalance in Russia's conventional military capabilities and Ukraine's on the other, plus the fact Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons, Russia does have nuclear weapons. And we've seen how Russia has been able to advance its aggression with conventional weapons by basically saying, don't get up to too much mischief because we have nuclear weapons. Ukraine, you don't. So I suspect that China probably thought, look, it's either going to be sort of a rerun or some kind of reprise of what we saw in 2014 with the incursion into Ukraine, or if there's an invasion, it's going to be over so quickly that the United States and its allies and partners are not going to really have any time to respond in any meaningful way. Well, obviously, those suppositions haven't been borne out. As you said, the war is now dragging on into month 4. There's really no sign that it's going to end anytime soon. I think that the emerging consensus among foreign policy observers around the world is that we really are now headed for, or I should say not headed for, but we're settling into a really grinding, brutal, messy war of attrition. It's going to be very bloody. It's going to be very gruesome. It's going to be very grisly. And it's going to be with us, I think, for a long time. That type of war of attrition is really not in China's national interest. I think, first of all, the externalities from this war, they also harm China's economy. So first, there are economic ramifications for China. There are also, I think, more importantly, there are reputational and diplomatic consequences for China. And Evan Medeiros, he talks about China's policymaking trilemma. So China right now, in dealing with Ukraine, it has 3 objectives. And when you have a policy trilemma, it's the idea of a trilemma is that it's difficult to achieve all 3 objectives simultaneously. China's first objective is it wants to maintain its partnership with Russia. Objective number 2, it wants to continue upholding, at least nominally, the norms of sovereignty and territorial integrity. And objective number 3, it wants to ensure that there isn't a permanent rupture in its relationships with the United States and with Europe. It's very, very difficult to sustain all 3 of those objectives. I think that the longer this war goes on, the more that Russia becomes this kind of reputational albatross around China's neck. So China is in a very, very difficult situation right now. And I think it's telling that China right now, it's not abandoning Russia. And again, as we've seen with the readout of the call between President Xi and President Putin, we see a very, very strong declaration of shared grievances. But China has been very, very careful. It is not, so far as we know, it hasn't provisioned military assistance to Russia. It hasn't, at least as far as we know, it hasn't violated Western sanctions on Russia. And I think that at least in some quarters of the Chinese foreign policy making establishment, there's a sense that Russia's recklessness, that Russia's adventurism, they could really be a strategic liability for Russia. So the relationship, it's strengthened on the one hand, it's also more strained on the other hand. And then the question is, what are the implications for U.S. foreign policy? And there's a certain irony actually in the conversation. So prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the discussion, the predominant sort of line of discussion in the United States was, how can we pry Russia from China? Can we kind of do a reverse Nixon? Can we pry Russia from China? So during the Cold War, of course, the United States made common cause with China, and its opening to China was predicated in large part on the belief that sort of if the United States and China were to make common cause, that the United States would be able to contest the Soviet Union more forcefully. So there was a thought prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine that perhaps we could orchestrate a variant of that diplomatic maneuver, pry Russia from China. And the thought was that we can basically feed on Russia's anxieties. Russia is anxious about becoming more and more of a junior partner. It's anxious about having China play more of a role in Central Asia, which Russia considers to be part of its sphere of influence. It's wary of China or it wants to have a deeper security relationship with India in Central Asia in light of America's withdrawal from Afghanistan. China wants to reduce India's role. So there was a lot, how can we pry Russia? Now, increasingly, it's the reverse. And the thought is, how can the United States prevail upon China to loosen its embrace of Russia? I think realistically, and for reasons that you've articulated, I think realistically, there probably isn't much in the short term that the United States on its own can do to pry apart that relationship. I think that the Sino-Russian Entente, I think it is not a reality to be eliminated. It's a condition to be met. I think that the Sino-Russian Entente is here to stay. Having said that, I do think that the Sino-Russian Entente going forward, I think that there are, as I just said a few minutes ago, I think that it is going to suffer increasingly from its own internal strains. I think, again, if you're China, you have to think about the medium to long-term strategic consequences of doubling down on this Entente, economically and diplomatically. Russia has its own apprehensions about becoming further beholden to China. So even though there isn't that much, I would argue, that the United States can do unilaterally, I don't think that the Sino-Russian Entente is sort of inexorably destined to go from strength to strength. I think that there are a lot of strains within that Entente. Externally, I think that the United States and its core democratic allies and partners, they have to demonstrate they can deliver. Well, what does that mean? They have to demonstrate, because there's a narrative right now that authoritarians are on the march, democracies are on their heel. And I would argue, I think that in light of China's competitive missteps, in light of Russia's competitive missteps, I think that this notion that authoritarians are on the march, I think it's a bit overstated. I think it's a bit hyperbolic. But that doesn't mean that democracies don't have their work cut out for them. They absolutely do. You look at the United States, over 1 million deaths due to COVID-19, well over 80 million infections due to COVID-19. Income and wealth inequality are surging. We see many instances of, we continue to see this plague of gun violence. We continue to see a range of socioeconomic challenges that are growing worse in the United States. We see a number, of course, internal socioeconomic challenges in many of our democratic allies and partners as well. So just because this narrative of authoritarian ascent or authoritarian resurgence, just because that narrative is understated, doesn't mean that democracies don't have their work cut out for them at home and abroad. Democracies also have to deliver abroad. They have to be able to demonstrate anew that they can mobilize coalitions to manage the pressing transnational challenges of our days: climate change, pandemic disease, macroeconomic instability. And they also, importantly, they have to demonstrate that where possible, that they can make common cause with their authoritarian competitors. As I said earlier, I find it very difficult to envision a scenario in which democracies can advance their own vital national interests at home and abroad solely by engaging with one another and basically saying, China and Russia, we're going to have nothing to do with you. I think that China and Russia, they're too large militarily, they're too large economically. So democracies have their work cut out for them, of course. I think that China and Russia in many ways have their work cut out for them as well. So even if the United States, I think that its short-term options for sort of prying apart China and Russia are limited, but I don't think that the Sino-Russian Entente is necessarily destined to go from strength to strength. I think that it will increasingly be burdened by some of its own internal tensions. And so in the meantime, as we allow those tensions to unfold and play out, I think that the United States and allies and partners should be asking themselves how they can demonstrate to the international community writ large that they can deliver at home and deliver abroad for the international community.